at the far southern edge of the world, where the land breaks into black water, freezing rain, and mountains that seem to rise straight out of the sea, Spain once tried to build a city. It was not a camp, not a trading post, not a passing shelter for sailors caught between oceans. It was meant to be a real city, with a church, a royal name, streets, families, soldiers, priests, seeds, animals, and the full confidence of an empire that believed geography could be conquered by ceremony. They called it Ciudad del Rey Don Felipe, the city of King Don Philip, and for a brief moment in 1584, it stood on the shore of the Strait of Magellan as one of the boldest Spanish claims in the entire southern hemisphere. Then it vanished into hunger so completely that when English sailors reached it 3 years later, they gave it a darker name, a name that still clings to the place like cold mist: Port Famine. The mystery is not simply that the city failed. Colonies failed across the early modern world. Ships sank, crops died, alliances collapsed, and men who had crossed oceans found themselves defeated by mud, fever, and distance. The deeper mystery is that this city died in a landscape where human beings had already lived for thousands of years. Long before Spain arrived with banners and iron, the peoples of the far south had learned how to move through this broken country, how to read its tides, how to hunt across its plains, how to paddle through its channels, how to gather food from coasts that looked barren to outsiders, and how to survive in a climate that destroyed European plans almost instantly. The Spanish saw emptiness, hardship, and a strategic passage. The indigenous peoples saw routes, seasons, animals, shellfish, wood, water, and the old logic of a world that rewarded movement and punished arrogance. The city began with fear. In 1578, Francis Drake passed through the Strait of Magellan and entered the Pacific, striking Spanish possessions with a violence and audacity that stunned the empire. Spain had treated the Pacific like a private sea, a guarded ocean reached through difficult passages and controlled by imperial distance. Drake proved that the southern gate stood open. The response from King Philip II was grand and desperate. Spain would fortify the strait itself, block English passage, and plant Spanish authority at the end of South America. The man chosen for the task, Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, was a navigator, soldier, cosmographer, and hard believer in imperial discipline. He understood the strait as a military throat between two oceans. Whoever held it could decide who passed into the Pacific, and whoever failed to hold it would leave Spanish America exposed. But the Strait of Magellan is not a gate in any simple sense. It is a twisting, hostile corridor of water, wind, rock, and sudden weather, where storms arrive with terrifying speed and where the distance between intention and survival is measured in food, firewood, and dry shelter. To a mapmaker in Madrid, the strait looked like a point to be secured. To sailors moving through it, it was a maze. To the people who already lived around it, it was a living system of channels, beaches, shell beds, guanaco ranges, sea lion colonies, bird rookeries, and seasonal routes. Sarmiento's plan carried the logic of Europe into a place that required the logic of Patagonia, and that mismatch became fatal before the first winter had fully closed its hand. The original Spanish fleet was far larger than the desperate group that eventually reached the strait. Storms, desertion, damage, and distance stripped the enterprise down. By the time the colonists reached southern South America, they were already weakened by the ocean itself. The people who landed were a mixed human cargo of empire: soldiers, sailors, civilian settlers, women, children, clergy, servants and craftsmen, along with cattle, sheep, goats, dogs, seeds, vines, fruit trees, tools, weapons, and religious objects. The plan was to create permanence. Spain would not merely pass through the strait, Spain would inhabit it. The crown would turn geography into possession by placing families there, by naming the land, by building a church, by raising crosses, by making the place Spanish through ritual and habitation. The human scale of the disaster matters because this was not simply a band of hardened soldiers left to fend for themselves. Roughly 340 to 350 people were tied to the colonizing effort in the strait after the great Atlantic disasters had reduced the fleet's original strength. The surviving landing group included more than 100 soldiers, dozens of sailors, settlers, women, and children. The exact count shifted as people moved, died, deserted, or were reassigned between the two Spanish foundations. But the tragedy included families. There were children who had crossed the ocean into one of the harshest environments on Earth. There were women expected to help anchor a permanent colony. There were priests expected to sanctify the city. There were soldiers expected to defend it. There were animals expected to multiply into herds. There were seeds expected to become gardens. There was an entire European dream of reproduction, agriculture, order, and command carried into a place that had already judged such dreams by wind and hunger. The first city, Nombre de Jesus, was founded near the Atlantic mouth of the strait, around Cabo Vírgenes. The second, Ciudad del Rey Don Felipe, was established farther west, near what is now Puerto del Hambre, in a sheltered bay south of modern Punta Arenas. Sarmiento and a smaller marching force moved westward to establish this second town, covering more than 200 kilometers through terrain that would have punished even healthy men. The decision made strategic sense from Madrid's perspective and from Sarmiento's military thinking. Two foundations would help control the passage, but in survival terms, it divided a weak population across a hostile corridor. Instead of concentrating strength, shelter, food, and labor, the Spaniards stretched misery into two places. The contrast with the indigenous peoples could not be sharper. Around the strait and the surrounding lands lived several distinct peoples, each adapted to a different part of the southern world. The Kawezka moved through the western channels by canoe, living from sea lions, fish, shellfish, birds, and the coast itself. The Yagan, farther south in the maze of channels around Tierra del Fuego and Cape Horn, were another maritime people whose canoes, fires, dogs, and intimate knowledge of shorelines allowed them to inhabit a world Europeans later described as impossible. The Aonikenk, also linked with the broader Tehuelche world, moved across the mainland plains, hunting guanaco and rhea, carrying a deep knowledge of inland Patagonia. The Selknam lived on Tierra del Fuego, tied strongly to guanaco hunting and the open steppe of the island. These peoples were not living in ease, but they were living within the rules of the place rather than against them. The Spanish looked at cold beaches and wind-scoured plains and saw deprivation. The indigenous peoples saw different food systems stitched together by movement. A beach at low tide was not empty. It was a pantry of mussels, limpets, clams, seaweed, birds, fish, and stranded marine animals. A rookery was not scenery. It was fat, meat, hide, bone, tendon, and oil. A guanaco herd was not wildlife in the abstract. It was clothing, sinew, tools, meat, and mobility. A canoe was not primitive transport. It was a technology that turned the shattered geography of Patagonia into a network. Fire was not simply warmth. It was the center of social life, food preparation, tool repair, and survival. The Spanish built a city. The indigenous peoples built lifeways that could move, adjust, and endure. The Spaniards attempted to cultivate plants, but the strait was a poor partner for European agriculture. Cold, wet, wind, short growing seasons, unfamiliar soils, and inadequate preparation worked against them. Seeds that would have meant hope in another colony became symbols of miscalculation. Fruit trees and vines belonged to a different climate, a different rhythm, a different empire of sunlight. Even hardy crops require time, protection, and human strength, and the colonists lacked all three. The settlement needed supply before it could become self-sufficient, and the supply chain broke almost immediately. Sarmiento sailed out seeking help, but weather, capture, delay, and imperial dysfunction turned his absence into abandonment. The city had been planted by the crown, but it was left to die almost outside the crown's reach. The written testimony from the survivor Tomé Hernandez and later analysis of the tragedy point toward a collapse shaped by starvation, cold, disease, fear, failed supply, and conflict. The settlers faced tension with local indigenous groups, and the Spaniards also faced the fact that they had entered a world where they were dependent on people they neither fully understood nor treated as equals. There were moments of exchange, observation, hostility, and confusion. The indigenous people did not simply stand outside the story as background figures. They were active inhabitants of the same landscape, and their survival exposed the Spanish failure. The tragedy was not caused by Patagonia being uninhabitable. It was caused by the Spanish choosing the wrong way to inhabit it. The name Port Famine came later, through English eyes. In January 1587, Thomas Cavendish entered the strait and reached the abandoned Spanish city. What he found was not the fortified barrier Spain had imagined, but a ruin. The town that had been meant to seal the Pacific had become evidence of imperial overreach. The streets and houses were empty, or nearly empty. The survivors were skeletal, desperate, and few. Fewer than 20 were still alive after 3 winters, and Cavendish took one of them away. That survivor, Tomé Hernandez, carried the story back into history, while the others faded into the cold edge of the map. Cavendish called the place Port Famine, and the English name cut through Spanish ceremony like a verdict. Archaeology has given this story a harder edge because it pulls the tragedy out of legend and puts it back into the ground. Excavations at Puerto del Hambre have tied the historical accounts to material traces, foundations, occupation layers, animal bones, food waste, and objects that place Spanish life exactly where the story says it stood. One of the most striking finds is a 16th century Spanish silver coin associated with the church foundation, a small piece of metal that carries enormous symbolic weight. A coin placed in such a foundation transforms a raw shore into a sacred and political claim. It says that this was not a wandering camp. This was a city claimed in the name of king and faith. Yet that same coin also becomes evidence of helplessness, because the metal survived while the city did not. The animal evidence deepens the picture. Bones from sheep or goats, birds, marine resources, and introduced animals show the strange blend of European expectation and local desperation. The Spanish came with goats, sheep, cattle, and dogs, but the diet at the edge of collapse had to turn toward whatever could be taken from the surrounding world. Birds, shellfish, fish, and marine animals belong to the food universe already understood by the indigenous peoples, yet the Spaniards were late learners under catastrophic pressure. A person trained by generations of coastal life can treat a shoreline as a map of edible timing. A starving colonist sees the same shore through panic, weakness, and ignorance. The difference between those two forms of knowledge is the difference between survival and death. The indigenous peoples of the strait did not thrive because the world was kind. They thrived because their societies were tuned to difficulty. The Kaweskar and Yagan canoe peoples lived in small mobile groups, often centered on family units, carrying fire, tools, baskets, weapons, and knowledge through a world where land and sea constantly interlocked. Their canoes allowed them to cross channels, reach islands, follow resources, and keep distance when needed. Their shelters were light enough to rebuild. Their diets were broad enough to absorb seasonal change. Their bodies and cultures were accustomed to damp cold, smoke, wind, and movement. European observers often misunderstood this as poverty because they measured wealth by buildings, herds, fields, and stored goods. In that landscape, mobility itself was wealth. The Ionekenk and Selknam reveal another side of the same principle. On the mainland and Tierra del Fuego, guanaco hunting shaped whole ways of life. Guanaco meat fed families. Hides became clothing and shelter. Sinews became cord. Bones became tools. Knowledge of animal movement became geography. The open steppe looked bleak to outsiders, but it held a living economy for people who knew how to follow it. The Spanish brought domestic herds into Patagonia because they believed familiar animals would recreate familiar society. The indigenous hunters followed wild herds because wild Patagonia already had its own system of abundance. The Spanish tried to transplant Spain. The indigenous peoples inhabited Patagonia. This is why the Lost City is more than a colonial tragedy. It is a confrontation between two understandings of survival. The Spanish model depended on command from far away, written authority, religious ceremony, fixed architecture, and faith that ships would maintain the lifeline. The indigenous model depended on accumulated local knowledge, oral memory, flexible movement, precise ecological timing, and social units small enough to adapt. The Spanish were not unintelligent. Sarmiento was highly capable. The soldiers were tough. The sailors had crossed oceans. The settlers had courage. But courage does not feed a city when the system around it fails. Intelligence from one world does not automatically transfer into another. There is also a moral darkness here that goes beyond hunger. The Spanish Empire arrived with the assumption that it had the right to occupy, rename, command, and defend a place already occupied by other human worlds. When the city died, it did not die in pure isolation. It died beside peoples whose existence contradicted the imperial fantasy of empty land. Those peoples had names, roots, laws, kinship, ritual, technology, and history. Later centuries would bring them catastrophe through disease, missions, violence, land seizure, and the expansion of ranching and state control. The tragedy at Port Famine was one early flash of a much larger collision, where Europeans repeatedly misread indigenous adaptation as backwardness, then watched indigenous knowledge prove superior in the very environments Europeans struggled to master. The dark ending of Ciudad del Rey, Don Felipe, is powerful because it reverses the usual colonial image. We are used to stories in which European ships arrive and indigenous worlds collapse. Here, at least for a time, the imperial city collapsed while the indigenous worlds around it endured. The Spaniards had iron, firearms, royal orders, Christianity, livestock, architecture, and oceanic ambition. Yet they could not hold a beach. The people they treated as marginal knew how to eat, travel, shelter, hunt, and endure there. The land did not respect paper authority. The wind did not care about the king. The tide did not deliver obedience. The cold did not distinguish between soldier and settler, priest and child. By the time Cavendish arrived, the city was already a ghost. The survivors he encountered were the last human fragments, of a plan that had once filled official imagination with strategic certainty. Behind them stood empty houses, abandoned foundations, broken hopes, and the silent church of a colony that had prayed for rescue. Around them stretched the same waters, beaches, birds and hills that the Kawaiskar, Yagan, Aonikenk, and Selknam knew through older forms of life. The Spanish city had tried to become permanent by standing still. The indigenous peoples had achieved endurance by moving with the world rather than against it. The most haunting image is not a battle, not a burning town, not a final heroic stand. It is a city waiting, people waiting through rain, people waiting through hunger, people watching the sea, people counting the days since Sarmiento left, people slaughtering animals meant for the future because the future had become impossible, people looking at cold forests and shell beds without the inherited knowledge needed to turn them into security, people buried, lost, scattered, or simply gone, children who had crossed an ocean for a city that could not feed them, women whose names largely disappeared behind the phrase, the colonists, men trained for war facing an enemy that could not be stabbed, a royal city reduced to appetite, and still the place refuses to become a simple lesson. It is tempting to say the Spanish were fools, but that is too easy. They were people caught inside the logic of their own age. They believed empire could solve distance, that faith could sanctify occupation, that animals and seeds could recreate Europe, that a fortress could control an oceanic passage, and that indigenous survival did not represent a more advanced knowledge of place. Their failure was not lack of bravery. Their failure was misreading the world. They mistook a lived landscape for an empty obstacle. They mistook possession for adaptation. They mistook arrival for belonging. That is why Port Famine still matters. It is one of those rare ruins where the imperial story turns inside out. The city meant to guard the strait instead revealed the limits of empire. The colony meant to prove Spanish power instead exposed Spanish dependence. The name meant to honor a king instead became a warning about hunger. And along the same cold channels where the city died, the older peoples of Patagonia continued to move through wind, water, fire, skin, shell, bone, and memory, carrying the knowledge that the Spaniards had failed to see until it was too late. The lost city did not vanish because the land was empty. It vanished because the land was already understood by others, and the empire arrived believing that understanding did not matter.